In the year 1552, the world stood divided between two incompatible visions of human order. To the east, the Ottoman Empire stretched across three continents like a tightening fist. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent commanded armies that had never known permanent defeat. His forces had already consumed Constantinople, Belgrade, and Rhodes. They had broken the walls of Vienna and sent tremors through every throne room in Europe. The Sultan did not negotiate. He not compromise. He conquered or he destroyed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, let's ease into today's history journey together. To the west, Christian Europe existed as a patchwork of distracted kingdoms, too proud to unify and too weak to stand alone. The Holy Roman Empire fractured under religious wars. France schemed against Spain. The Italian states murdered each other over trade routes. And Hungary, once the shield of Christendom, had been shattered at the Battle of Mohacs 26 years earlier. Most of its territory belonged to the Sultan now. What remained was a thin corridor of fortresses strung across the northern border like the last teeth in a dying mouth. Between these two worlds stood a man no chronicler had deemed worth recording until history forced his name into permanence. István Dobó was neither a brilliant general nor a celebrated knight. He was a provincial nobleman in his 40s, scarred by smallpox, weathered by decades of border warfare that offered no glory and little hope. He had watched friends die in forgotten skirmishes. He had buried his wife. He had learned that survival required endurance, not heroism. In the spring of 1552, the Hungarian crown appointed Dobó captain of Eger Castle. It was not an honor, it was a sentence. Eger guarded the northern approach to Vienna and the heartland beyond. If Eger fell, the road to Austria lay open. If Eger fell, the remaining Hungarian fortresses would collapse in sequence like dominoes carved from bone. If Eger fell, there would be no Christian kingdom left east of the Alps within a generation. Dobó arrived at Eger to find 2,000 souls sheltering behind walls built for display, not siege. There were farmers who had never held a sword. There were women who had fled burned villages with children clinging to their backs. There were perhaps 300 trained soldiers, many of them wounded or old. The fortress armory held outdated cannons and insufficient powder. The food stores might last weeks under rationing. The morale hung like fog over a graveyard. And then the scouts returned with impossible news. Sultan Suleiman had unleashed his finest general, Ali Pasha, with orders to erase Eger from existence. The Ottoman force numbered between 35,000 and 40,000 soldiers. Elite Janissaries who had conquered empires, siege engineers who had toppled the greatest walls in the world, artillery batteries that could turn stone into dust. The math was obscene. 20 attackers for every defender, against an enemy that had broken nations. Dobó stood on the walls and watched the horizon darken with banners. The Ottoman army arrived like a storm, given physical form. For 3 days, the people of Eger watched from the walls as the horizon transformed into a living sea of men and steel and purpose. Tents rose in perfect geometric rows that stretched beyond the limits of vision. Banners snapped in the wind, each one representing a regiment that had crushed cities whose names were now forgotten. The sound began before the army fully arrived. Drums, thousands of drums beating in coordinated rhythm that made the ground itself seem to pulse with malicious intent. The air thickened with the smell of horse sweat and leather and the smoke from 10,000 cooking fires. The defenders stood frozen on the ramparts, watching their death assemble itself with methodical patience. Dobó walked among them and saw the mathematics of despair written on every face. A blacksmith from the outer villages clutched a pike he did not know how to use properly. A mother held her daughter's hand while staring at the Ottoman engineers who were already surveying approach angles. An old soldier who had survived Mohacs stood trembling, not from fear but from the certain knowledge that what broke Hungary's army would now break this castle with even less effort. Dobó did not offer speeches. He had learned long ago that words could not defeat numbers. Instead, he gave orders in the same flat tone he used for inventory counts. Reinforce the northern wall, move the powder stores to the interior keep, ration the grain immediately, assign women to the water stations, place children in the deepest cellars where collapsing stone might spare them for a few hours longer. The preparations felt like arranging flowers on a grave. On the fourth day, Ali Pasha sent his demand. It arrived carried by a single horseman dressed in silk that shimmered like oil on water. The message was brief and absolute. Surrender the castle immediately, and the population would be enslaved but permitted to live. Resist, and every soul would be executed. The children would be taken for the Janissary corps. The women would be distributed among the soldiers. The men would be impaled on stakes along the road to Buda as a permanent lesson in the price of defiance. The messenger waited in the courtyard with the expression of someone who had delivered this ultimatum 100 times before and had never once been refused. Dobo read the demand twice. He looked at the faces surrounding him. He saw farmers who had already lost everything once. He saw mothers calculating whether slavery might at least preserve their children's lives. He saw garrison soldiers who understood military reality with brutal clarity. Then he tore the parchment in half and handed it back to the messenger. "Tell Ali Pasha that Eger stands," Dobo said. "Tell him we will give him nothing but blood and time." The messenger's face registered genuine surprise, then contempt, then pity. He rode back through the gates, and the defenders watched him disappear into the ocean of Ottoman soldiers who would now be tasked with killing everyone inside these walls. That night, Dobo could not sleep. He walked the ramparts alone and performed the calculation that commanders must make when they have condemned thousands to death. 2,000 defenders against 40,000 attackers. Walls built for ceremony against siege engines that had broken Constantinople. Weeks of food against months of encirclement. The math allowed only one conclusion. Eger would fall. The only question was whether it fell in days or weeks. But weeks might matter. Every day the Ottomans spent at Eger was a day they could not spend advancing on Vienna. Every cannonball they fired here was one they could not fire at Austrian walls. Every soldier who died in these ditches was one fewer marching toward the heart of Christian Europe. Eger could not survive, but it could delay. It could wound. It could become such a costly prize that the Ottoman advance faltered long enough for reinforcements to arrive from the west. It was not hope, it was arithmetic written in the currency of sacrifice. The bombardment began at dawn. The sound arrived before comprehension. A thunder that originated from the earth rather than the sky. 40 Ottoman cannons firing in synchronized sequence, each one larger than anything the defenders had ever seen. The balls were carved stone and cast iron, some weighing 200 pounds. They struck the northern wall with impacts that made teeth rattle and hearts stutter. The first volley killed 11 people. A section of the outer rampart simply ceased to exist, replaced by a cloud of pulverized stone and human matter. The survivors stood paralyzed, staring at the empty space where their friends had been standing 3 seconds earlier. The second volley arrived before the dust settled. Dobo ran toward the impact site and found chaos. Wounded soldiers screaming, a woman searching through rubble for her husband, with hands already shredded and bleeding. A support beam hanging at an angle that meant the wall section above would collapse within hours. He grabbed the nearest officer. "Get repair crews to the breach. Move the reserve powder away from the northern magazine. Pull everyone back from the outer wall until the barrage stops." The officer stared at him. "Captain, if we abandon the wall, they will. They will bombard empty stone instead of living bodies," Dobo said. "We cannot stop the cannons. We can refuse to stand where they aim." It was the first adaptation. Not heroic, not glorious, simple refusal to cooperate with the enemy's mathematics. The bombardment continued for 6 hours without pause. The Ottomans had brought enough powder to sustain fire that would have bankrupted most European kingdoms. Each impact carved away another piece of the northern defenses. By midday, the outer wall looked like a jaw with half its teeth torn out. Smoke hung over the castle in a pall that blocked the sun and turned noon into twilight. Then the cannon stopped. In the sudden silence, the defenders heard something worse. Digging. The Ottoman engineers had begun mining operations. Tunnels driven toward the foundation walls, packed with explosive charges designed to collapse entire sections from below. It was the standard sequence for professional siege warfare. Bombardment to weaken, mining to collapse, infantry assault to exterminate. Dobo assembled his officers in the keep while the ground trembled with distant digging. He spread a map across the table. It showed Eger's walls, the surrounding terrain, and the vast Ottoman encampment. "They will breach the northern wall within 3 days," he said. "When they do, they will send the Janissaries through in waves we cannot stop with conventional defense." A young nobleman interrupted. "Captain, perhaps if we sortie during the night we would die in the darkness and accomplish nothing," Dobo said. 2,000 soldiers charging 40,000 is not bravery, it is waste. "Then what do we do?" someone asked. Dobo stared at the map, at the impossible numbers, at the geometry of annihilation. "We make them pay for every inch," he said. "Not with courage, with cruelty." He began issuing orders that had nothing to do with honor, and everything to do with making Eger into a wound that would not stop bleeding. Boil every pot of water in the castle. Collect every piece of scrap metal. Prepare oil for heating. Build interior barricades behind every breach point. Arm the women with knives and rocks. Position the children where they could carry ammunition without exposure to fire. Turn the castle into a machine designed not for victory, but for extracting maximum cost. That night, the first Ottoman mine detonated. The explosion erupted from beneath the northeastern tower, like the earth vomiting stone. The tower lurched sideways and collapsed into its own foundation. 40 defenders died instantly, crushed under falling masonry. The blast left a gap in the wall wide enough for 100 men to march through, shoulder to shoulder. Before the dust settled, the Ottoman drums began beating the attack rhythm. Janissaries poured toward the breach in a disciplined wave. These were not conscripts or mercenaries. They were the elite core of the Ottoman military machine. Men taken as boys and forged into weapons through decades of training. They moved with mechanical precision, shields locked, scimitars drawn, utterly confident that the rabble defending Eger would shatter like pottery against their advance. They reached the breach and climbed through the rubble into the courtyard beyond, where Dobo had prepared his cruelty. The Janissaries found themselves in a killing corridor. The defenders had built interior walls that channeled the attackers into a narrow space, dominated by elevated firing positions. Arquebuses fired from windows, crossbows released from murder holes. And then, as the Janissaries pressed forward, the women appeared on the walls above, carrying pots of boiling water and heated oil. They poured death onto the men below. The screaming began immediately. Oil adhered to skin and cloth and kept burning. Boiling water found gaps in armor and cooked flesh beneath. The Janissaries stumbled backward, discipline fracturing, only to collide with the next wave pressing forward. Dobo stood on the interior rampart and watched with the expression of a man performing necessary butchery. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph. Only the grim awareness that this would have to happen again and again until everyone was dead. The Janissaries retreated, leaving 70 bodies in the breach. But they would return. They always return. The siege settled into a rhythm that felt like slow strangulation. Every morning the Ottoman cannons woke the fortress with thunder. Every afternoon the engineers detonated another mine. Every evening, the Janissaries attacked through whatever gap had been torn in the defenses. And every night the defenders dragged their wounded into the keep and counted how many fewer hands they had for the next day's butchery. The walls of Eger began to resemble a corpse in progressive decay. The northern rampart existed now only as scattered piles of rubble held together by determination in improvised timber supports. The eastern tower leaned at an angle that defied physics. Entire sections of the outer fortifications had simply vanished, replaced by craters deep enough to hide a horse. But the castle had not fallen. This fact began to disturb Ali Pasha. The Ottoman commander sat in his silk pavilion and studied reports that made no strategic sense. 3 weeks had passed. His forces had fired over 15,000 cannonballs. His engineers had collapsed 4 major wall sections. His Janissaries had launched 19 separate assaults. By every measure of professional siege warfare, Eger should have surrendered after the first week or been overrun by the second. Instead, the fortress continued to bleed his army. The latest casualty count reported 3,000 Ottoman dead. 3,000 elite soldiers consumed by a provincial castle defended by farmers and women. The number felt obscene. Ali Pasha had conquered fortresses 10 times stronger with a fraction of these losses. Something was wrong with the mathematics. He summoned his senior officers. They gathered in the pavilion where maps covered every surface and the air smelled of incense meant to mask the stench of the dead rotting in the ditches below Eger's walls. "Explain to me," Ali Pasha said with dangerous calm, "how 2,000 peasants continued to resist 40,000 of the Sultan's finest warriors." The officers exchanged glances. No one wanted to speak first. Finally, the chief engineer cleared his throat. "Commander, the defenders are not fighting conventionally. They have abandoned standard siege doctrine entirely. When we breach a wall, they do not attempt to hold it. They retreat to prepared interior positions and turn each breach into a killing channel. We advance through gaps only to find ourselves trapped in spaces designed for slaughter. Then stop advancing into their traps, Ali Pasha said. If we do not advance, we cannot take the castle, another officer said. The breaches exist, but the defenders have made each one more costly than storming an intact wall. Ali Pasha stood and walked to the map of Eger. He stared at the castle's layout, trying to understand the mind of whoever commanded its defense. Who leads them? He asked. A minor nobleman named Istvan Dobo, an intelligence officer, replied. No significant military reputation, no recorded victories. He was appointed to Eger because no one else would accept the post. This nobody has cost me 3,000 men, Ali Pasha said. What does he want? What is his objective? The question hung in the air because the answer was obvious and infuriating. Dobo did not want victory. He wanted time. Every day the siege continued was a day the Ottoman advance stalled. Every soldier who died at Eger was a soldier who could not march on Vienna. The castle was not trying to survive. It was trying to become expensive enough that the strategic calculus shifted. Ali Pasha recognized the tactic because he had used it himself against numerically superior enemies. It was the warfare of the trapped and desperate. It worked only if the defender was willing to accept total annihilation as the price of delay. Intensify the bombardment, Ali Pasha ordered. I want every cannon firing continuously. I want the mines detonated simultaneously to collapse the entire northern section. And I want 5,000 Janissaries prepared for a final assault that will not stop until every defender is dead. His officers bowed and departed to implement orders that would reduce Eger to rubble and everyone inside it to corpses. Ali Pasha remained alone with the maps, troubled by something he could not articulate. He had broken stronger fortresses. He had defeated better armies. But those victories had felt clean, mathematical, inevitable. Eger felt different. It felt like wrestling something that refused to acknowledge it was already dead. Inside the castle, Dobo stood in what remained of the command post and faced a crisis that had nothing to do with walls or weapons. The food was gone. Not dangerously low, not rationed to starvation levels. Gone, the last stores had been distributed that morning. By tomorrow, there would be nothing to eat except the horses, and those were needed to move equipment and wounded. After the horses, there would be nothing. Starvation would accomplish what the Ottomans had not. It would break the defenders' ability to fight within days. Dobo looked at the faces of his remaining officers. There were fewer of them now. Some had died in the assaults. Some had succumbed to infected wounds. The survivors looked like men who had aged 20 years in 3 weeks. Their eyes held the peculiar emptiness that comes from seeing too much death too quickly. How long can we fight without food? Dobo asked. The question was absurd, but someone answered it anyway. Perhaps 2 days at current intensity. After that, people will be too weak to carry weapons or boil water. And reinforcements? There are none coming, an officer said quietly. The other fortresses are besieged. The Hungarian king has no army to send. Vienna knows we exist only as a delay. We were never meant to survive. The words settled over the room like falling ash. Dobo walked to the window and looked out at the Ottoman encampment. Even in the failing light, he could see the geometric precision of their organization. Endless rows of tents, artillery parks larger than some towns, supply trains that stretched to the horizon. The Ottomans could sustain this siege for months, years, if necessary. Eger had days. He turned back to his officers. Then we use the days we have to make those months impossible. Captain, without food we cannot. We can burn their supplies, Dobo said. The room went silent. One of the younger officers spoke carefully. A sortie against the Ottoman supply depot would require penetrating their entire encampment. We would need to cross 1,000 yards of open ground, breach their perimeter, ignite their stores, and return through an alerted enemy force of 40,000 men. The casualties would be total. Yes, Dobo said, which is why they will not expect it. He moved to the map table and began sketching the plan with the matter-of-fact tone of a man describing inventory management rather than suicide. We send 200 men, not our best fighters, our fastest runners. We go at midnight when the moon is dark. We carry nothing but torches and accelerants. We do not fight unless trapped. We run to the supply depot, we burn everything we can reach, and we run back. Most will die, but if even 20 men reach those supplies and ignite them, the Ottomans lose weeks of food and powder. They will be forced to either abandon the siege or wait for resupply from Istanbul. And if no one returns? An officer asked. Then we have traded 200 lives to buy Vienna 2 additional weeks, Dobo said. The mathematics favor the attempt. The room absorbed this logic. It was insane. It was also correct. I will lead the sortie, Dobo said. Every officer began speaking at once. The captain could not be risked. The defense would collapse without his leadership. He was too valuable to waste on a near-certain suicide mission. Dobo cut through the protests with a raised hand. If I order men to certain death while I remain safe behind these walls, I am not a commander. I am a coward wearing rank. The sortie goes at midnight. Volunteers only. I will be the first man through the gate. He dismissed the officers before anyone could argue further. Word of the sortie spread through the castle within the hour. Dobo had called for 200 volunteers. By sunset, over 400 had assembled in the courtyard. Men who could barely stand from exhaustion. Women who had buried their children. Old soldiers who had nothing left to lose. They understood the mathematics. They knew the sortie was suicide dressed in tactical language. They volunteered anyway because Dobo had shown them that defiance had value even in the absence of hope. Midnight arrived with a darkness so complete it felt like the world had been erased. No moon, no stars, just absolute black, broken only by the distant cooking fires of the Ottoman camp. Dobo stood with 200 volunteers at the castle gate. They carried torches wrapped in oil-soaked cloth. They wore dark clothing and had smeared their faces with ash. They looked like ghosts preparing to haunt their own deaths. He gave no speech. There was nothing left to say that had not already been proven in 3 weeks of impossible resistance. The gate opened with a sound like bones cracking. The volunteers poured into the darkness and ran toward the Ottoman encampment with the desperate speed of men who knew they had perhaps 10 minutes to live. They covered the open ground in terrifying silence. The Ottomans had grown complacent after 3 weeks of static siege. Their perimeter guards were watching the castle walls, not the ground in front of them. The sortie penetrated the outer line before anyone raised an alarm. Then the screaming began. Ottoman soldiers stumbled from their tents to find shadows running through their camp with torches. The defenders moved with singular purpose toward the massive supply depot at the encampment's center. They ignored everything else. They did not stop to fight. They simply ran and ran and ran through the chaos they were creating. Dobo reached the supply depot first. It was a city unto itself. Thousands of barrels containing powder and grain and salted meat. Wagons loaded with cannonballs and weapons. Tents housing equipment worth more than most kingdoms' annual revenue. He threw his torch into the nearest powder barrel and dove away. The explosion turned night into day. Fire erupted across the depot in a chain reaction of detonating powder stores. Flames climbed into the sky like living towers. The heat became so intense it created its own wind. Secondary explosions rippled outward as the fire found more powder, more oil, more anything that could burn. The Ottoman encampment descended into pandemonium. Thousands of soldiers ran in every direction. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Horses broke free and stampeded through tent lines. And through it all, the fire continued to spread and consume and destroy. Dobo ran back toward Eger with perhaps 30 survivors following him. The rest had been cut down or consumed by the flames they had unleashed. Ottoman soldiers charged from every direction. Arrows fell like rain. The air filled with smoke so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. A Janissary appeared directly in Dobo's path, with scimitar raised. Dobo did not slow down. He simply lowered his shoulder and crashed into the man with enough force to send them both sprawling. He scrambled to his feet and kept running without looking back. The castle gate stood open ahead like a mouth waiting to swallow the few survivors home. Dobo threw himself through it with 10 men behind him. The gate slammed shut. Crossbow bolts from the walls drove back the Ottoman pursuit. He collapsed against the interior wall and gasped for air that tasted like ash and copper. His hands were burned. His lungs felt seared. Blood ran from a dozen wounds he had not noticed receiving. But behind him, the Ottoman supply depot burned with flames visible for 20 miles. From his pavilion, Ali Pasha watched his logistics dissolve into smoke and understood with perfect clarity that the siege had just become unsustainable. The fire consumed enough supplies to feed his army for 2 months. The powder stores were gone. The reserve weapons were destroyed. He could continue the siege with what remained. He could still break Eger through sheer weight of numbers. But the cost had become obscene. 4,000 dead, supplies destroyed, and winter was approaching. If he remained here much longer, he would lose the entire army to cold and starvation rather than combat. For the first time in his career, Ali Pasha considered the possibility that a fortress he could certainly conquer might not be worth conquering. Inside Eger, the defenders watched the flames and allowed themselves something they had not felt in 3 weeks. Not hope, but the absence of certain doom. The Ottoman bombardment stopped on the 38th day. The silence felt more terrifying than the cannons had. The defenders stood on what remained of their walls and watched the massive army begin to dismantle itself. Tents collapsed in coordinated sequence. Artillery pieces were hitched to horses and dragged toward the roads leading south. Supply wagons formed into columns that stretched beyond the horizon. Ali Pasha was withdrawing, not in panicked retreat, not in defeat that could be celebrated, but in the calculated decision of a commander who had determined that victory would cost more than it was worth. He left behind 4,000 dead in the smoldering ruins of his supply depot. He took with him an army still powerful enough to conquer nations. But he did not take Eger. Dobo watched from the shattered northern wall as the Ottoman banners disappeared into the distance. Around him stood the survivors, 943 souls from the original 2,000. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They simply stood in silence and breathed air that no longer smelled of gunpowder and death. A young girl approached Dobo and tugged at his sleeve. She was perhaps 7 years old, filthy with ash, her eyes too old for her face. She held out a piece of bread she had been saving. "For you, Captain," she said, "because you stayed." Dobo took the bread with hands that trembled, not from exhaustion, from the weight of understanding what had just occurred. This castle had not defeated the Ottoman Empire through superior force or brilliant tactics. It had simply refused to cooperate with its own annihilation for long enough that the mathematics shifted. 2,000 people had made themselves more expensive than conquest. News of Eger's survival spread across Europe like fire across dry grass. The impossible fortress. The siege that broke the unbreakable army. Within weeks, other fortresses found courage to resist. Supply lines stiffened. The Ottoman advance, which had seemed as inevitable as dawn, began to slow and then to stop. Not because of grand armies or brilliant generals, because a scarred provincial nobleman and 2,000 souls had stood in a crumbling castle and refused to fall when every calculation said they must. Years later, historians would analyze the Siege of Eger and debate tactics and strategy and the role of leadership in impossible circumstances. They would measure casualties and powder expenditure and the strategic value of delayed advances. But they would miss the essential truth. History does not turn on what should happen according to mathematics. It turns on what actually happens when ordinary people decide that some things matter more than survival. When a blacksmith picks up a sword he does not know how to use. When a mother pours boiling water on soldiers because her children are sheltering in the cellars below. When a captain tears up a surrender demand and condemns everyone to probable death because the alternative is certain annihilation. Eger did not survive because it was strong. It survived because it refused to calculate whether survival was possible. And in that refusal, the defenders changed the geometry of an empire. Dobo stood on the ruined walls as autumn wind carried the smell of coming winter. The castle would need to be rebuilt. The dead would need to be buried properly. The wounded would require months to heal if they healed at all. But the walls still stood. The gate remained closed to the enemy. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the Ottoman Empire was learning that conquest had limits measured not in armies or artillery, but in the willingness of ordinary people to become extraordinary when history demanded it. The siege was over, but what it proved would echo across centuries. That 2,000 souls could face 40,000 and refuse to break. That impossibility was a statement of current mathematics, not permanent truth. That civilization survives not because it is inevitable, but because in specific moments, in specific places, specific people decide that it must. Dobo placed his hand on the scarred stone of Eger's wall and felt the pulse of something larger than nations or empires or the ambitions of sultans and kings. He felt the heartbeat of defiance that would not die. And in that moment, standing among ruins that had refused to fall, he understood what the survivors of Eger had truly accomplished. They had not defeated an empire. They had reminded the world that empires could be defeated. The rest would follow in time.